The next important concept in Python that we're going to discuss is file input and output, or I/O. I/O is how we read data from files and write data to files. And since everything in Python is an object, we have file objects that will help us with this. And so we create a file object with the open function. And one very helpful thing that Python has is we can optionally specify a mode for opening this file. If we don't specify a mode, it'll be reading, which I'll get into in just a moment. So if we don't include anything, it will be R by default. But files can be opened for reading, which means we can only take data from the file but not write to it, which is useful if you don't want to accidentally overwrite any data in a read-only file. We can open a file for writing, which is kind of self-explanatory. We're writing some output to a file. Or we can open a file in mode A for appending content to a file. So say you have a logging function which you want to add to a file but never completely overwrite the file. You want to be sure that you're just adding content. You can use the append mode, or A, to handle this for you. And so here's a fairly common structure here. We'll see that there's an easier way to handle this in just a moment, but this is one way of handling this, where we're creating a file object called input file by running the open function on a file one directory up /static/populardognames.txt, and we're opening this in read mode. So if I go look one directory up and look in static and then populardognames.txt, this is the file we're looking at, the file we're reading. So now we have a file object called input file. Like any object, this can have methods. So like we saw with the string .upper and some of the methods from list, like reverse, right? There are also methods for file objects. And so one of these is readline, which gets a single line from a file. There are many others. You could do, for example, read, which just gets the whole file. But this is one way of handling individual lines in a file. And so we're storing that in the variable first line. And now we have this open file. We don't want to just leave it dangling open, so we run this .close method on it. And so we're printing out the content, read this data from the file, first line. And so if I go ahead and run this, you'll see that it's read some content from this file. The first line, in fact. And there's a little quirk here. You can see that this has a quotation mark that we've added explicitly to this string here, or an apostrophe, a single quote. But the closing single quote is on a new line, and that's because this string contains a new line character. And so that's just a quirk to be aware of. We could actually run the .strip method of a string to remove that, and then you'll see that the closing apostrophe here, the closing quote, is back on the same line. And so this just strips out any white space from around a string. Okay, so that is how we read from a file. We can also open a file in W mode. So we're going to be opening one directory up /static/tempfile.txt in mode W for writing. And then we're going to write to that file with the write method of output file. And the content is first line. And then similarly, we run the close method to close that file. So if I go back here and I look for the file tempfile.txt, you can see that it contains the first line of that file that we read. You can also get all of the lines of a file with .readlines. So there are a few options here. You can read line for a single line. You can read for the whole file as a single string, or you can read lines for a list of lines in the file. But of course, you want to be careful if this file is very large. And another thing to be aware of is that if you're working with binary files rather than plain text, you need to open them with RB for read, WB for write, and AB for append. And you may find the struct library helpful. Now, it's very common to open a file and then need to close it later. And this is such a common construct that there is a way of handling this in Python that's a little bit cleaner. And so there's a very common pattern, which is try to open a file, and then if that works, you'll read from or write to the file, and then close it. And this is so common that there is a statement that helps simplify this, and that is with. And so if we say with open our file, the location of our file, the mode as, and then the variable name. So this is similar to saying input file equals open as we had before. But now we have a block of code, and within this block of code, input file is open, but once we leave that block of code, input file is automatically closed. So this is a very nice way of handling I/O, and this is how I'd recommend you use it in practice. And so in this case, we are opening the file populardognames.txt in mode R. We are looking at all of the lines in the file as a list. We're printing out the length of that list, and we're printing out the first and last line. So if I go ahead and run this, you can see it contains 20 lines. The first line is what we saw before, and this is the last line of that file. And now once we exit this with clause, the file is automatically closed. Now with works with other objects as well. It doesn't just work with files. You need to create the methods enter and exit in a class, and we'll talk about classes later, but just be aware that with isn't just for files, it works in other places too, as long as the developers have implemented enter and exit.